But this brings up a massive, painfully grounded question.
I know where you're going with this.
If you are listening to this right now, you might be nodding along thinking this is brilliant. But tomorrow morning, when your boss unfairly criticizes your work, or your partner does that one thing that drives you crazy, or you read a headline that triggers your political rage, are you actually going to pause, take a deep breath, and say, let me perform a Bayesian update on my prior probabilities and check my map against the territory?
Unlikely.
Exactly. You aren't going to do that.
Yeah.
You're going to get defensive, you are going to get angry, and you're going to dig your heels in. So if these are the ultimate cheat codes, why is it so incredibly hard for us to actually utilize them when it matters most?
And this exact tension is where the dialogue between Max and Claude takes a sudden, highly introspective turn.
They get real.
They do. They pivot from theoretical physics to the messy reality of human psychology. Claude essentially calls Max out.
What does he say?
He says, Max, you are highly articulate about Bayesian updating. But in your actual lived experience, when you encounter evidence that shatters one of your core beliefs, do you actually update? Or do you instinctively hunt for reasons to defend your original stance?
Oof, that is a direct hit.
It is. And Max, to his immense credit, drops the intellectual facade. He admits the truth. He says, I feel resistance.
And that single word, resistance, is our gateway into part 2 of this deep dive, the architecture of cognitive resistance.
Claude dissects this admission of resistance with surgical precision.
Yeah.
He doesn't let Max brush it off. He breaks this resistance down into 2 very distinct, very powerful phases: cognitive resistance and emotional resistance.
Okay, let's examine the cognitive side first.
Right. Dismantling a complex intellectual framework is, structurally speaking, an incredibly difficult task.
It's exactly like Thomas Kuhn's concept of paradigm shifts, isn't it? Kuhn looked at the history of science and made a rather cynical but highly accurate observation about how brilliant scientists actually behave.
Yes. Kuhn noted that when a new mathematically superior theory emerges, say the shift from a Ptolemaic Earth-centric model of the solar system to a Copernican sun-centric model, the scientific community does not look at the new telescope data, collectively slap their foreheads, say, we were wrong, and smoothly adopt the new model.
No, they fight it tooth and nail. They actively try to destroy the new evidence.
Because the old guard has built their entire careers, their textbooks, their prestige on the old paradigm. Kuhn argued that old paradigms are rarely gracefully abandoned through logic.
So how do they change?
Instead, the people who hold the old paradigms simply have to age out and eventually die, allowing a new generation of scientists who grew up with the new data to establish the new paradigm. That is cognitive resistance playing out on a multi-generational societal scale.
To bring that to an individual level, think of your worldview as a massive, intricate game of Jenga.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
If you hold a belief about how capitalism works or how a marriage should function, that belief isn't floating in a vacuum. It is a foundational block at the bottom of the tower.
Dozens of other beliefs, habits, and daily decisions are stacked on top of it. If new evidence forces you to do a Bayesian update on that core belief, you aren't just swapping out a line of code.
You are pulling a load-bearing block.
Right.
And when you pull that block, it changes the weight distribution of your entire mental tower. The whole structure of your worldview wobbles and often collapses into a chaotic mess on the table.
And nobody wants that.
Exactly.
Yeah?
It is intellectually terrifying to face that collapse. It is so much easier, so much more stable to just swat the new evidence away and keep your tower standing.
The more exquisite and interconnected your intellectual framework is, the more profound the cognitive resistance you'll feel to tearing it down. But Claude argues that the second type of resistance is even more insidious and much harder to overcome: emotional resistance.
This is where it gets deeply personal.
Yes, this occurs when our models cross the boundary from being tools we use to becoming identities we are.
This is where the danger truly lies. Like, if I have a literal hammer and the handle snaps, I throw it in the trash and buy a new hammer. I don't mourn the hammer.
Right.
But if a belief has become fused to my sense of self,
Then an attack on the belief is processed by your brain as an attack on your physical survival. Claude connects this to Daniel Kahneman's behavioral economic principle of loss aversion.
right, Kahneman.
Kahneman proved that human beings feel the psychological pain of losing something roughly twice as intensely as they feel the pleasure of gaining something of equivalent value.
So losing $100 hurts much more than finding $100 feels
Yeah.
good.
Exactly. But Claude applies loss aversion not to money, but to ideas.
That is profound.
When you are presented with evidence that destroys a cherished, identity-bound belief, your brain does not process it as, oh, wonderful, I have gained a new, more statistically accurate perspective on reality.
And nobody thinks that way.
No. Your brain processes it as a genuine, visceral loss. It triggers actual grief. It triggers a defensive ego response. You are no longer operating in a state of intellectual curiosity. Your amygdala has hijacked the wheel, and you're operating in pure survival mode to protect your sense of self.
And what's fascinating is how Max attempts to deflect this diagnosis. He looks at his own history of resisting new evidence, and he tries to offer a very casual excuse.
He tries to play it off.
He does. He says, well, maybe I'm just lazy. He tries to use laziness as a blanket explanation for why he doesn't update his models. And Claude immediately calls his bluff.
This is one of the most masterful sequences in their entire dialogue. Claude does not let Max hide behind laziness. He points out a glaring empirical contradiction in Max's behavior.
Claude looks at Max and essentially says, hold on, look at your life. You are a person who curates over 50 complex mental models. You read incredibly dense philosophy for fun. You're writing academic papers, coding, and exploring the depths of epistemology late into the night.
Right, he's incredibly driven.
You have an immense capacity for sustained effort. You are the exact opposite of a lazy person. So what is actually happening in your mind?
Claude realizes that Max is mislabeling his own internal map. Laziness is an inaccurate, low-resolution label. It is a convenient, low-energy excuse designed specifically to help Max avoid investigating the true, highly uncomfortable nature of his own psychological resistance.
It's a shield.
Yes, if he can just claim he's lazy, he doesn't have to face the terrifying prospect that his identity is fragile.
This brings up what I think is the most profound quote in the entire source material. We have to talk about the psychological physics of demolition.
Let's do it.
Claude says building a new framework provides dopamine, a sense of progress, structure, and control. Tearing down an old framework offers no immediate reward. It only offers temporary chaos and a frightening loss of control.
It is a stunning insight into neurobiology and learning. Think about the distinct types of energy required for those two actions. When you are learning a brand new topic, say building a new mental model about a field you know nothing about, your brain chemically rewards you.
You feel good.
You do. You get a dopamine hit from snapping those pieces of information together. You feel smarter. You feel like you are conquering new territory and imposing order on the universe. Building feels fantastic.
It's constructive energy, like building a beautiful Lego castle. You can see your progress block by block.
But dismantling a deeply held belief. Demolition requires a fundamentally different, much darker, heavier kind of energy. There is zero dopamine hit when you suddenly realize you've been entirely wrong about something for 5 years.
None at all.
There is no immediate rush of progress when you plunge your own mind into confusion and ambiguity. Tearing down an old framework feels like stepping off solid ground into a void. It requires a tremendous amount of intellectual courage and a high tolerance for psychological pain things that most people simply refuse to endure.
And to definitively prove this to Max, Claude doesn't just theorize about it. He actually performs a live, real-time Bayesian update right there in the text, using Max's own behavior as the dataset.
It is a brilliant structural move. Claude sets up two competing hypotheses to explain Max's resistance.
Okay, what are they?
Hypothesis 1, Max is simply lazy. This is a global, low-energy explanation. Hypothesis 2, Max has a highly specific, intense psychological fear of dismantling systems that are intricately bound to his identity.
Then Claude introduces the new evidence. Max works tirelessly, reads constantly, and expends massive amounts of energy when he's building new knowledge structures.
Now, Claude runs the Bayesian calculation. If hypothesis 1, that Max is lazy, were true, he wouldn't possess the energy to build new things. The evidence completely falsifies hypothesis 1.
Right.
However, if hypothesis 2, that Max fears the chaos of demolition, is true, it perfectly explains the contradiction. It explains why Max has boundless energy for creation, but sudden, paralyzing laziness when it comes to destruction.
The probability weight shifts entirely.
Overwhelmingly to hypothesis 2. Claude uses the very tool they are debating, Axis 1, Bayesian updating, to diagnose his conversational partner's psychological block.
Max must have been sitting there feeling incredibly exposed.
No, I'm sure he was.
But he digests it, and it prompts him to ask a natural follow-up question, which moves us into part 3 of our deep dive.